여러분 안녕하십니까, 돌콩입니다. 오랜만이죠. 네, 현생을 사느라 좀 바빴습니다. 한국도 한번 다녀오고 부모님이랑 여행도 다녀오고 그러는 새에 벌써 여름이 왔습니다. 오늘 좀 특별한 영상을 가지고 왔습니다. 영상 길이가 조금 길 것 같아서 여러분들 팟캐스트처럼 이렇게 편안하게 들어주시면 될 것 같고, 제가 작가님들 인터뷰를 가끔 하잖아요. 근데 진짜 거부할 수 없는 작가님을 만날 기회가 있어가지고 그 영상을 여러분들이랑 나누려고 가지고 왔습니다. 바로 앤드류 포터 작가님이신데요. 소설 좋아하시는 분들, 특히 해외 문학을 좋아하시는 분들이라면 모르실 수가 없는 작가님이라고 생각을 합니다. 이미 너무나 국내에서도 많은 사랑을 받으신 작가님이고 한국에도 2번을 오셨다고 하더라고요. 저도 유튜브 이렇게 찾아보니까 은희경 선생님이 그 무슨 북 페스티벌 이런 데서 인터뷰하신 그 클립도 봤고, 저는 개인적으로 앤드류 포터 작가님을 어떻게 알게 되었냐, 그게 한 2016년? 17년? 그러니까 거의 한 지금으로부터 10년 전이죠. 사회초년생으로 이제 취업해가지고 회사 다니고 출퇴근길에 김영하 작가님이 하시는 책 읽는 시간이라는 팟캐스트를 굉장히 즐겨 들었습니다. 근데 이제 그 팟캐스트에서 뭐 김영하 작가님이 이런저런 작품에 대한 이야기도 해주시긴 하셨지만 이렇게 많이는 얘기를 안 해주셨던 걸로 기억하고 그냥 작품을 소리내서 쭉 낭독을 해주시는 팟캐스트였어요. 근데 거기에서 한 에피소드에서 이제 김영하 작가님이 읽어주신 소설 중에 이름이 굉장히 특이했어요. 빛과 물질에 관한 이론이라는 소설이 있었습니다. 단편 소설이죠. 듣는데 너무 좋은 거예요. 정말 그 기분을 아직도 잊을 수가 없어요. 세상에 이런 소설이, 이런 아름다운 게 있다니 이러면서. 그래서 이제 그때 책도 사서 읽어보고 그랬는데 그 작품을 쓰신 작가님이 바로 앤드류 포터 작가님이셨던 거죠. 물론 그 뒤로 이제 여러 가지 책들도 나오고 사라진 것들이라는 책도 나오고, 빛과 물질에 관한 이론 제가 이거 원서로 지금 가지고 있는데 이건 단편 모음집인 거죠. 그리고 이 표제작인 빛과 물질에 관한 이론이라는 작품이 여기에 들어가 있습니다. 네. 그런데 이번에 이제 앤드류 포터 작가님의 장편 소설이 신간이 이제 한국에서 출간된다 해가지고 그 원작이 이 책이거든요. The Imagined Life, 상상 속의 삶이라는 번역 제목으로 이번에 문학동네에서 출간이 되었어요. 벌써 나왔습니다. 오늘 보니까 베스트셀러 그 배너가 네이버에 가니까 벌써 붙어 있더라고요. 그만큼 우리나라에 팬이 많다는 이야기겠죠. 여러분들 그 서머 리딩 리스트 만들고 계십니까? 이미 저는 꽉 차가지고 책을 읽는 속도보다 책을 추가하는 속도가 늘 당연히 빠르니까 그래서 막 터져 나가고 있는데, 그럼에도 불구하고 다른 책들을 다 이제 밀어놓고 이 책을 읽었습니다. 너무 좋았어요. 그 좋은 소설을 읽고 나면 그 행오버, 약간 술 마시고 나면 그 취기가 빨리 안 가시잖아요. 그런 것처럼 소설을 읽고 나면 그 소설의 여운이 안 가셔서 거기에서 허우적거릴 때가 있는데 이 소설이 약간 그랬습니다. 이야기 자체의 줄거리는 굉장히 간단합니다. 주인공은 스티븐이라는 지금 현재 시점에서는 50대 정도의 남자예요. 결혼해서 아내도 있고 아들도 있습니다. 알리슨이라는 아내와 핀이라는 아들이 있어요. 그리고 삶이 조금 순탄하게 흘러가지 않아요. 요즘 이 시점, 50대가 된 시점에서 직업도 좀 그렇고 잘 안 되고 커리어도, 무엇보다 아내와의 관계가 삐걱대기 시작합니다. 이제 별거를 하기 시작을 하게 되는데 그런 것들이 여러 가지가 맞물리면서 왜 우리가 삶에서 약간 뭐가 잘 안 풀리고 흔들리기 시작하면 도대체 어디서부터 잘못됐을까 이런 생각을 하게 되잖아요. 그래서 이 스티븐도 마찬가지로 본인의 그 과거를 이렇게 거슬러 올라가다 보니까 아버지라는 존재가 있는 거예요. 근데 이 아버지라는 존재가 굉장히 특이한 사람이었습니다. 아버지는 사라졌어요. 스티븐이 어렸을 적에. 근데 아버지가 사라지기 전에 본인이 어렸을 때 그 어린 시절에 아버지의 기억이 있는 거예요. 그래서 아버지가 왜 정확히 사라졌는지, 어디로 사라졌는지는 당연히 모르고 굉장히 미스테리한 사람으로 남아있는데, 그 아버지를 본인이 생각했을 때 떠오르는 기억들을 하나씩 되짚어 가면서 이제 과거로 돌아가는 거죠. 스티븐이 11살 때 시절로 이제 돌아가서 어린 시절에 스티븐이 바라보는 그 아버지를 독자는 읽게 됩니다. 여러 가지 사건 사고들이 있고 아버지 주위에 여러 인물들이 있어요. 아버지는 영문학 교수였습니다. 근데 이제 테뉴어를 받기 전에 테뉴어를 준비하는 교수였고 굉장히 실력도 있고 과에서 이제 뭔가 인기도 많은 그런 사람 있잖아요. 성격이 굉장히 매력적이어가지고 인기도 많은 사람이었던 것 같아요. 스티븐의 기억 속에는 이제 집에서 어머니랑 아버지가 그 동료 교수들, 친구들을 초청해가지고 파티를 하던 그런 기억들도 굉장히 많이 남아있고 그래서 여름에 읽으시면 좋습니다. 여름에 그 이미지가 있어요, 이 책에. 그래서 그 여름에 어떤 수영장이 있는 집에서 파티를 할 때 그 저녁의 어떤 분위기랄지 그 냄새랄지 그 소리들 이런 것들을 아주 감각적으로 묘사를 하고 계시거든요. 그래서 그 서머 리딩으로 꼭 읽으셨으면 좋겠어요. 근데 아무튼 그런 기억들이 스티븐의 머릿속에 남아있는 거죠, 본인이 어릴 때. 근데 어릴 때 아버지는 조금 의문스러운 사람이었습니다. 갑자기 좀 뭐 사라진다든지 아니면은 데릭이라는 그 동료 교수를 집에 데리고 와서 그 사람이랑 필요 이상으로 시간을 많이 보낸다든지 아버지가 노트 같은 거 이제 영문학을 전공하는 사람이니까 책이랑 노트 같은 게 있는데 좀 잘 이해가 안 되는 그런 노트들이 있다든지 그래서 스티븐은 좀 원인 모를 아버지에 대한 불안감도 있어요. 그리고 아버지가 아직 테뉴어를 받기 전에 교수이기 때문에 테뉴어를 못 받으면 어떡하나 그 상황에 대한 불안감이 가정 전체에 흐르고 있는 거예요. 그래서 뭐 이사를 가야 될 수도 있고 이사를 가야 되면 본인의 친구들이랑도 다 이별을 해야 되는 그런 상황이잖아요. 그래서 알게 모르게 그 불안감을 느끼고 있고 또 스티븐은 아이의 그 눈 시선으로 어머니를 관찰하게 되죠. 그래서 알게 모르게 이 어머니가 뭔가 계속 스트레스를 받고 피곤해 보이는 그런 모습 그런 것들을 관찰하게 됩니다. 굉장히 재밌는 부분이 뭐냐면 이 소설을 읽으면 아이의 눈에서 바라보는 그 상황의 묘사를 독자는 읽게 되잖아요. 근데 우리는 어른이니까 그 묘사를 이렇게 읽었을 때 우리가 추측해서 이런 거 아닐까 싶은 것들이 있어요. 그러니까 아이가 화자인데 화자가 모르는 걸 독자는 좀 해석하고 이해할 수 있는 어떤 그런 불균형, 재미있는 불균형이 생깁니다. 그래서 그런 것들을 느낄 수 있는 재미도 있죠. 그래서 그것들이 이제 거슬러 올라가면서 아버지를 생각하면서 그 주위에, 아버지 주위에 있었던 인물들을 이 50대에 접어든 스티븐이 찾아가서 만나기도 하고 아버지는 어떤 사람이었나요? 어디로 사라졌나요? 아버지의 동생, 그러니까 삼촌이죠. 줄리안 삼촌을 만나기도 하고 그 데릭이라는 사람, 아버지가 계속 집에 데리고 왔던 굉장히 외모도 수려하고 아주 영화배우처럼 생긴 사람으로 묘사가 되고 있어요. 그 사람한테 편지를 보내가지고 얘기하고 싶다라고 이야기를 하기도 하고 아버지의 동료 교수를 찾아가기도 합니다. 그 아버지가 결국은 그 테뉴어를 못 받거든요. 근데 아버지가 테뉴어를 받은 삶은 어떨까? 다정한 아버지, 내 곁에 있어 주었던 아버지와 함께 살았다면 나의 삶은 어떤 모습이었을까? 지금 현재의 삶에 내가 가지고 있는 문제들이 지금과 많이 달랐을까? 이런 상상 우리도 하잖아요. 여러 가지 선택을 하면서 살게 되니까 이제 그런 상상 속의 삶을 이제 머릿속으로 그려보는 거죠. 그러면서 이제 굉장히 다양한 사람들이 전해주는 아버지에 대한 이야기를 수집을 하게 됩니다. 그리고 나서 벌어지는 이야기가 되죠. 결말은 스포하지 않겠습니다. 여러분 마지막 챕터가 또 아주 좋으니까 보셨으면 좋겠고요. 제가 작가님께 여쭤보고 싶었던 것들이 뭐 여러 가지가 있었는데 첫 번째로 사랑을 하면은 우리는 사랑을 하는 상대에 대해서 더 많이 알고 싶어지고 전반적으로 이해하고 싶어지잖아요. 그리고 사랑하는 사람 사이에는 비밀이 없어야 될 것 같고 그런데 그렇지 않거든요. 이 책은 보면은 첫 번째로 아버지란 사람에 대해서 알면 알려 할수록 질문들은 자꾸 더 생겨나요. 그럼에도 스티븐은 아버지를 사랑한다라는 사실을 알게 되죠. 여기에서 사랑을 가능케 하는 것은 무엇인가? 그럼에도 불구하고 우리가 상대를 다 이해할 수 없음에도 불구하고 사랑이란 감정은 가능한 것인가? 그렇다면 왜 가능한 것인가에 대해서 작가님께 여쭤봤고 그에 대한 굉장히 멋진 답을 작가님께서 해주셨습니다. 그리고 제가 아까 말씀드렸듯이 사랑을 하면은 사랑하는 상대와 나 사이에는 비밀이 없고 모든 것이 다 공유되어야 할 것 같은데 작가님은 그렇게 생각하시지 않는 것 같았어요. 제가 볼 때. 왜 그러냐? 그 스티븐의 굉장히 사적인 모먼트들이 나와요. 차우라는 친구가 있어요. 어렸을 적에. 그 차우라는 소년과의 어떤 그 굉장히 비밀스러운 순간들을 공유를 하게 되는데 차오에게 어떤 일이 일어나는지도 제가 스포하지 않겠습니다. 여러분들 책으로 직접 읽어보시기 바랍니다. 어떤 책의 클라이막스 중 하나에 해당하는 부분이라고 생각을 하거든요. 그 순간들을 비밀스럽게 간직하고 삽니다. 어머니에게도 이야기하지 않고 다른 사람한테 떠벌리지 않아요. 그렇다고 스티븐이 어머니를 사랑하지 않는 건 아니고 아버지를 사랑하지 않는 건 아니고 말하지 않는다고 해서 사랑하지 않는 건 아니에요. 또 신기하죠. 그런데 이런 비슷한 그 테마라 그래야 되나? 그런 것들이 작가님의 다른 작품들에서도 변주가 된다라는 느낌을 저는 받았어요. 아까 말씀드린 빛과 물질에 관한 이론, 그 책. 이름이 어렵죠? 근데 물리학 뭐 이런 거 아니야 생각하실 수 있는데 물리학을 공부하는 학생이 이제 주인공이어서 그런 식으로 제가 볼 때 타이틀이 된 것 같아요. 그런데 사랑 이야기입니다. 읽어보시면 대학생이 주인공이에요. 헤더라는 여학생이 주인공인데 아주 재밌습니다. 재밌다기보다 한 번 읽으면 평생 잊을 수 없는 소설이라고 저는 생각을 해요. 그 소설은. 거기에서도 이제 마지막 장면, 그 소설을 읽으신 분들이라면 제가 무슨 말 하는지 아실 거예요. 그 굉장히 나만 알고 있는 그 순간에 대한 묘사가 있어요. 그래서 나라는 사람의 정체성을 만드는 어떤 기억의 조각 같은 것들이 있는데 그것들을 뭐 굳이 다른 사람한테 꺼내놓고 다 줄줄이 이야기하지 않는다고 해서 내가 이 사람을 밀어내거나 또 사랑하지 않는 것은 아니라는 생각이 들어서 아주 미묘하죠. 살다 보면 언어의 한계이기도 하고 사람과 사람 사이의 어떤 관계의 한계인 것 같기도 해요. 그럼에도 불구하고 서로를 계속해서 사랑하고 알아간다는 것은 어떤 것인가, 그런 것들에 대한 생각을 하실 수 있는 아주 아름다운 소설이라는 생각을 합니다. 특히 80년대 음악, 영화 좋아하시는 분들 읽으시면 그 문화적인 레퍼런스들이 굉장히 많이 언급됩니다. 그런 것들을 보는 재미도 있어요. 그리고 제가 언제 또 작가님 만나 뵙겠습니까? 그래서 작가님의 글쓰기 루틴, 습관 같은 것들도 여쭤봤고 작가님 또 상도 엄청 많이 받으신 분이고 또 그 크리에이티브 라이팅, 소설 쓰기 강의도 이제 대학에서 하고 계시기 때문에 그런 학생들을 많이 만나보셨을 거라고 생각을 했어요. 습작을 하는 친구들을. 그래서 습작하는 사람 입장에서 저도 요즘 글쓰기 열심히 하고 있습니다. 여러분들 막 수업 들으면서 열심히 쓰고 있는데 습작하는 사람들에게 해주고 싶은 말씀들. 사실 글쓰기라는 게 내가 글을 써서 다른 사람한테 주고 다른 사람이 읽는다는 특성이 있잖아요. 그렇기 때문에 어떻게 보면 누군가가 나의 글을 알아봐주고 인정해주고 이런 것들이 굉장히 중요하게 느껴질 때가 있는 것 같아요. 굉장히 그걸 못 느끼면 내가 잘못하고 있는 것처럼 그렇게 느껴지기도 하고 창작을 하는 사람들의 어떤 공통적인 어려움이기도 하겠지만 그걸 넘어서 무엇을 추구해야 우리가 건강하게 오랫동안 글을 써나갈 수 있는지에 관한 이야기도 여쭤봤습니다. 글쓰기 하시는 분들 또 창작에 관심 있으신 분들께 많은 도움이 되었으면 좋겠습니다.
When you started writing this book, where did you get the idea? Was there a specific scene or character, or was it kind of a continuation of the disappear? Because the imagined life is obviously about a father who disappeared, and the story was described by his son's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that theme of disappearance is something that I've begun to notice is in all of my books. So it's obviously a preoccupation of mine, but this book really grew out of the opening 2 paragraphs, which I wrote long before I actually wrote the rest of the novel. And, you know, I have a habit of writing openings for stories that I may or may not, that may or may not turn into something. And, the ones that kind of stick with me, I return to and continue to tinker with and build on. And this was one of the pieces that I kept returning to. And I really didn't think it was going to be a novel at first. I thought it was going to be a short story. But the more I wrote my way into kind of the opening chapter of it, the more the scope of it began to seem bigger. And I realized I was probably writing a first chapter. But I would go back periodically and kind of tinker with it. And then at a certain point, I just decided to kind of commit to the novel. But it really grew out of the voice in those first 2 paragraphs.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at the paragraph and that part, like, my wife Allison warned me about the danger of getting too close to something I might not want to know. She reminded me of what had happened when she had gone through her own mother's journal. So all of us kind of experience this similar moment, I think, in life. We have to look back and go back and revisit to get to know better about what happened in the past, but we are scared because we don't know what we're going to encounter and confront.
Yeah. And especially, I think, when in the case of this character where he's going back to learn about his father, right? You know, sometimes we want to know certain things about our parents' past, and other times we perhaps don't.
It's really surprising sometimes. I realize how little I know about my parents, especially my parents before I was born. I know nothing about them. And I still love them, but I get to realize that love is based on or built on such a incomplete knowledge.
That's very true. You know, is sometimes the people we love most in life are the ones that are also kind of a mystery to us. And I think our parents are a great example of that. You know, a few years ago when my father, my actual father, passed, all of these letters and emails came in from people who'd known him at different points in his life. And all of these emails and letters like told stories about things that had, you know, memories that, you know, fond memories they had. And these were things I knew nothing about. I'd never heard these stories before. Often I didn't know who these people were. And you know, I was really thinking about that a lot, how there are all these things about his life I just never knew.
I think we want to know more about people we love. That's kind of the curiosity, I think, is essential part of loving. And we have that desire always, but it is impossible to gain the full knowledge, I think, about someone. Stephen's dad described by person A was just different from someone described by B in this book. And there are different fragments that he puts together, I think. And I think we get to one truth, and that is it's almost impossible to know someone fully. What makes love still possible?
The people we love, like, we don't fully know them, just as they don't fully know us and can never fully know us. I think that that's something that most people at a certain point just begin to accept. But that doesn't mean that you can't get to know somebody better. And I feel like in this novel, Stephen does get a better understanding of his father. He certainly learns more about him, and his sense of his father is certainly more complex. But I think that this idea of going back and feeling like you can get all of the information and kind of put it all together like a puzzle is just, you know, not something that's possible, because the more we learn about people, the more questions come up.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's what happens
sure.
with Stephen is he learns all this stuff about his father, but everything he learns just raises new questions. And he realizes at a certain point, there's no end to these questions. But that doesn't mean you can't have a kind of full and rich understanding of someone.
That mystery, that uncertainty. Sometimes like love feels very fragile because of that uncertainty and parts that we don't know. But I think still like carrying on and daring to decide to love someone, I think, is a beautiful thing, probably because of that incompletion, I guess, and uncertainty.
Yeah. And I think in some ways, perhaps we like the things that we don't know, or we like the fact that there is mystery around people. You know, even someone you maybe have been friends with for 30 years, you know, they can surprise you. You can learn new things about them.
Yeah. And I think it's related to my next question. Sometimes, even if there is a chance to get to know about them better, we decide to refuse to do that, to protect ourselves or protect our love or friendship with that person or image of that person that I currently have probably is a sense of self-preservation, I guess. And there is always that tension. And we learned that selfless love is true love. I don't know, but I picked up this idea here and there, and you should love someone selflessly and you should be able to sacrifice yourself to genuinely love someone. But in reality, it's not like that. I feel like I should survive first to love someone is how I feel. What's your thoughts on genuine love when self-preservation and that desire to protect myself enters in the equation?
I think that that's absolutely true. I mean, I think that those two things are very much in tension, I think, with many relationships. And again, to kind of return to the novel, we see that with like Stephen's parents, right? Where the mother loves the father, but at a certain point you see her instincts to preserve herself kick in, right?
Yeah.
Not as much early in the novel, but as it goes on, she feels a need to protect herself, right? You know, I think that instinct is just as strong as the instinct to love. And sometimes the people that we love are not always the people who are healthiest, you know, for us to be, you know, to have in our lives. And that was the case, I think, with like Stephen's parents. Like the mother loved the father intensely and he loved her, but the father was not a healthy person for the mother to have in her life. And she gradually begins to see that and understand it. So yeah, I think those two things are very much always kind of in opposition to each other. Yeah.
It was interesting to see the mom, Maya, look tired very often when Stephen was young. There was a discussion a lot like mom looked very tired. It's true that it is tiring to balance between those two conflicting, I think, emotion, loving someone, but protecting myself.
Yeah, I think that is true. But interestingly, I think we see also with her, you know, thinking of a kind of selfless love. If there ever is selfless love, it's perhaps you see it most between, you know, a parent and their child. And I think with Stephen, there is certainly a more selfless type of love that we see from his mother directed toward him.
For sure, yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between Stephen and Chow. It was very special and I really liked reading those pages and how it ended up being was also heartbreaking. Like, I'm not gonna spoil for the people who haven't read this book, but yeah, those intimate moments that are unshared by anyone else, those memories are only carried by Stephen only in this entire world. I was thinking about the last scene of your previous book, The Theory of Life and Matter, and that ending scene, that moment that the Heather only knows, and she writes about that, she talks about that in the book, and I read that book like 10 years ago, and that scene was just carved somewhere in my heart, burnt in my brain, and I think I have lived with those scenes, I think, for the last 10 years. And what do those memories tell about who we are and what it means to be human? What do you think you keep coming back to describing those moments?
It's interesting you mentioned that the end of that short story, The Theory of Light and Matter, in that moment with Heather, because I think there's a line in that ending where she says, the greatest truths lie in the secrets we keep from each other. And that kind of speaks to that idea that there's sometimes a greater truth in those moments that we don't share, right? And it's always interesting to consider why we share certain memories with people, even the people we're closest to, and then not other ones, right? And I don't know, I'm endlessly kind of fascinated by why that is, because it's not always secrets that are a big deal, right? Sometimes it's just memories that are personal and that you want to keep for yourself, right? And so those things, they make up your identity, right? Just as much as the shared memories do. But there's something special, I think, about the memories that we choose not to share, right? And reflecting on why we don't share particular memories is interesting. I find it interesting. I keep writing about it. So there's something very personal, and it's a part of your identity that's private, right? And I think that having that is essential for everybody.
So there are a lot of cultural references in this book. You mentioned a lot of films and music.
For me, it was one of the pleasures of writing this book was going back into the early 80s and just allowing some of these cultural references to flow into the book. I never consciously decided, I need to drop in some pop culture references here or there. They grew organically out of the story, but I would find myself in a particular moment. For example, like there's a moment where Stephen finds himself like wandering through the house of Chow's sister's boyfriend and going through the rooms. And I had to imagine like what would be on what posters would be on the wall of, a teenage boy in 1983 or whatever. And that was fun to do. Yeah. So, I mean, to me, like those moments also help me to imagine the world of the book. I'm a big fan of film. I started college as a film major, and it's always been a kind of interest of mine. And one of the fun things about a novel is if you're interested in something personally, you can just have a character who's interested in that, and it gives you a chance to kind of indulge that interest a little bit. But yeah,
For sure.
that was fun as well.
Okay. Oh, so you studied film at some point in your life.
Yeah, initially
Wow.
I think my plan was to try to be a filmmaker, or to try to break into the film industry in some capacity. And then I took a fiction writing class and kind of got sidetracked from that.
Do you still desire to make your own film at some
I
point?
mean, I would love to. I think I still, when I think of story, I think very visually. And so I think that instinct is still there. I would love to see one of my books be made into a film. But I mean, I think the train has left the station in terms of me directing a film. But I certainly, I mean, I watch films, and it's a huge passion.
It's imagine the life, like becoming a filmmaker, the other
Right.
side that we couldn't live on. Interesting.
That was my imagined life.
I care for these characters, I think, a better way to speak. When I finish this book, I wish Stephen very well, but also I care for Allison and the son Finn. And when I care for the main characters and think about what's gonna happen to them, I realize how much I was immersed in a story and how much I have loved this book. In the end, I don't know, Stephen was crying, so I was crying too, I guess, and I was like, don't cry, you make me cry type of moments. As a writer, or as a person who orchestrated this story all along, why would you hope for Stephen and other characters?
My sense is that Stephen had found a certain amount of peace with his past by the end, and certainly with his father in that relationship. And I just hope that he continues to have peace with his past. And like you, I hope that, things continue to work out with Allison and Finn, and that they stay together. And so those are probably the things I wish most for him. And I tend to be an optimist, in certain ways. And so I have an optimistic view of what lies ahead for them as a family. I'm hopeful that this new chapter in their life will be a good one.
I'll ask several questions about you and your writing. Do you have any writing habits that you have kept for years that actually make some differences in your work?
Yeah, I have a routine that I have stuck to for many years, and it's personal to me, but I would encourage, anyone pursuing writing to kind of figure out what works well for them. I figured out, that the type of space that I tend to work in, I need to have natural light. I like for it to be quiet, those types of things in terms of environment. And then I have a little ritual, which is pretty simple, but before I sit down to write, I usually read for a little bit, maybe 20 minutes or so, drink some coffee, and then I write. But I think it took me years to realize that I needed to have a period of transition between like my regular life and that time where I'm writing fiction, that I couldn't just go from writing an email for work to writing a scene in a piece of fiction. And so giving myself that transition time, it's almost like a kind of meditation in a way when I'm reading, where I just fall into a different state of mind, and then I come out of that and I'm ready to write fiction. So that ritual has been a big part of my process now for a while, and I just try to honor that when I sit down to write.
You teach too, right? Do you currently teach, right? How do you balance between the job and your creative time?
Yeah, it's hard sometimes, to be honest. Things get busy in the middle of the semester, and it's hard sometimes to find little pockets of time to write during the school year. So I do a lot of my writing in the summers or during breaks. Right now I'm beginning a sabbatical. So I have the fall semester off, and so I usually get the vast majority of my fiction writing done during sabbaticals, which I have every 5 years or so. And so just, when I have the time, taking advantage of it, and realizing how valuable it is just to have free time to write. I used to always feel so guilty when I wasn't writing, and I would kind of I was hard on myself and I would feel
Right.
guilty or ashamed. And I came to realize that sometimes life is just busy and you have to kind of allow for that and give yourself some grace. I remember when my kids were very young, I went through several years where I just couldn't find any windows of time to write because my life was so chaotic. And I gave myself such a hard time during that period. And I felt guilty every day for not writing fiction. But the truth is I made it through. And that period of time, I wish I just allowed myself to fully enjoy it and not been so hard on myself,
Whenever I say I'm busy and I'm not writing, I feel so bad because I feel like writing is not prioritized enough. Like I'm busy with other things, but I'm not writing. So it's like, does that make sense? I was asking myself all the time and I feel so bad. But the grace, the word that you use, maybe what I need for myself a little bit, because feeling guilty is not how we make it sustainable. Right. It's a long game, and
that's exactly right. That it is a long game, and it's not as a writer friend of mine used to say, it's not a foot race. Every story takes a different amount of time to reveal itself, and you can't force it. So
writing, language learning, things like that in life are sometimes like it's a long game, so I don't see the end point. What do you think I shamelessly use we, including myself, aspiring writers should strive toward beyond like some specific like feasible goals like award winning or publication or fame or success?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is that, a lot of that external stuff, the getting published or winning an award or getting a good review or, whatever it may be, the happiness from those things is a fleeting type of happiness. And the real happiness comes from creating a piece of art that you feel proud of, that's exactly as you want it to be. And I say that partly because, when I was younger, I was often in such a rush to get something published that I would send out things before they were finished. In a few cases, pieces that were kind of not quite ready ended up getting accepted and published. And the feeling of having something in print that I wasn't happy with was terrible. I didn't want to tell anyone about it. I didn't want to share it with friends. And I learned pretty early on that the real happiness comes from the work itself, whether it becomes published or whether it wins an award or whatever happens to it when it leaves your desk. The one thing you can control is how you feel about it and getting it to a point where it's exactly the story that you want it to be.